honored to be joined here on the panel today with my colleagues, Dr. Miriam Sullivan, who's a senior director at JFF. Miriam is leading JFF's research efforts to identify the current state of diversity and equity in U.S. apprenticeships for young people, and she also recently completed a phenomenological analysis to explore the experience of Black young women in STEM apprenticeship pathways. Next to Miriam, we have Brianna McCain, who is the author of a recent brief, Modernizing Apprenticeships and the National Apprenticeship Act to Promote Inclusive Economic Growth. Brianna is with JP Morgan Chase. Next, we have Jack Porter, who's a senior policy analyst with the NGA Center for Best Practices. Jack is currently leading a year-long PIA Policy Academy to advance youth apprenticeship that's working closely with governor's offices in 6 states to develop policy agendas that advance high-quality youth apprenticeship opportunities. And then finally, we have, once again, Ryan Gensler, who's the Executive Vice President of CareerWise USA. Ryan helped to start CareerWise Colorado and leads CareerWise's technical analysis team, which has been providing support to PIA and many of the communities in this room. So I'm going to kick us off with a context-setting question and go to Miriam and Jack first. And I'd like to start by just getting a sense of, we've heard a lot over the last 24 hours about the momentum that's building behind youth apprenticeship in the United States. What are you seeing and hearing from the folks that you work with in your networks all over the country in terms of what's behind that momentum?
Thanks, everyone, for having me participate in this session. And I'm thrilled to open with this question. At JFF, our Center for Apprenticeship and Work-Based Learning, we started this work back in 2017, really responding to the field and all of the federal investments. I think yesterday we heard a little bit from Manny and Ryan about all of the funding that's being put in the field, really to spur the mainstream adoption of registered apprenticeship. And in looking at the room, it feels like it's pretty much worked. So 2015, we had the inaugural investments with the American Apprenticeship Investment Funding. But in 2019, the intentional focus on youth started to happen. We started seeing that pivot where the Department of Labor put out funding for these youth apprenticeship intermediaries, and Jobs for the Future is a federal contractor, but there are 3 others. So this is really grounding the work, putting organizations in the field to support the work, to support K-12, to support employers, to sort of like codify and document what's happening in the field and just generally be a resource. The department continued in 2020 with more investments around the Youth Apprenticeship Readiness Grant. So putting funding into the hands of K-12, intentionally looking at 16 to 24-year-olds. So we have about 34 organizations doing this work. And then most recently with the Apprenticeship Building America grants, JFF has one where we're Category 2. I've talked to a couple of people or a few organizations in the room that are also ABA grantees. But Category 2 focuses on youth apprenticeship. So that continued through line. And the funding really matters, right? People can be intentional, sit back and focus. And it's been great from my perspective at JFF, seeing how what started with sort of like an idea, let's build the field back in 2015, and now seeing this room full of organizations all like intentionally focusing on youth apprenticeship. So that momentum, spurring, starting at the federal level, seeing states and local governments putting, the power of the purse behind what is an important priority.
Jack, what about in the States?
Sure. Yeah, thanks again for having me, Sarah. I think, step 1A for establishing and sustaining the momentum for youth apprenticeship is putting great groups like CareerWise and New America on the case. Here we are, second afternoon of programming. After lunch, we still have a full room, so kudos to you all for that. Obviously, one of Governor's highest priorities is growing their state economy, and just about every workforce development and economic development policy conversation that we're having right now is almost dominated by the labor shortage in terms of employers not finding enough talent. And of course, one variable in that equation is the youth labor force participation rate. We're down about 20% from where we were in, say, 1990. And so I think our members, employers, understand the need to reach and serve, youth through any means possible. And so I think the success of apprenticeship broadly has kind of like lended a good deal of credibility to the youth apprenticeship model as like an effective way of engaging today's youth.
Thanks. Ryan, I'm going to go to you next. 2 questions. What is the vision for youth apprenticeship that we want to advance, and what role do you see public policy and investment playing in advancing that?
Well, that's a big question. I think we heard from Ursula and we heard from Noel, the true power of youth apprenticeship is much greater than any single program can provide. It's really reinstilling hope and dignity in all types of learning and all types of work. I think more practically in the nearer term, it's the idea that youth apprenticeship is a norm. It's a normalized education model, not just workforce training and not a last resort for an average age of 30-year-olds like we talked about. So when we think about youth apprenticeship, we think about it as apprenticeship that's truly education aligned. That education is actually using apprenticeship as a key form of how young people are learning and developing, and it's a lifelong practice. It's not just this 3-year thing that happens in high school. We do believe that youth apprenticeship does need to start in high school. And I think that's something that's a big debate right now. And I'm hopeful that policy starts to define that a little bit, because right now youth apprenticeship doesn't technically have a federal definition. And so we're seeing a lot of variations of that across different states. And that variation can be really confusing for families and parents that are trying to figure out what the right path is for their young people. It can be very confusing for employers who are trying to figure out what programs can help them develop talent in a meaningful and localized way. And it's really confusing for our state systems to figure out how to fund these things if we don't have a common approach, if we don't have a common definition. And so I think that's something that we really need to work towards at a national level and then practiced at a state level. And there has to be that local nuance to these things.
Great, thanks. Rihanna, your recent brief focused on federal policy. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you see as the role of the federal government in helping to advance youth apprenticeship, and then walk us through a little bit of your key recommendations from that brief as well?
Yeah, to your point, one of our recommendations was actually around making sure there was a federal definition for youth apprenticeships. That's incredibly important, particularly when you're thinking about ensuring that there's comprehensive federal data on youth apprenticeships. To effectively develop policy, you need data, and also this data is incredibly important for making the case for youth apprenticeships. So just want to give you kudos for calling that out. But in addition to that, we're really focused on the reauthorization of the National Apprenticeship Act. So for some context, the National Apprenticeship Act was enacted in 1937, and it hasn't been reauthorized since. I think that we can all agree that a lot has changed since 1937. And while steps have been taken to modernize apprenticeships, Congress can help to further modernize apprenticeships by reauthorizing the National Apprenticeship Act. Given time, I'll just focus on a couple recommendations that the JP Morgan Chase Policy Center put forth. One of them, like I mentioned, was around having a federal definition for youth apprenticeships. And again, that's incredibly important to make sure that we have comprehensive federal data that we can use to inform policy and make the case for youth apprenticeships. Also, we would love to see the National Apprenticeship Act reauthorization address some of the barriers that employers face when trying to expand access to youth apprenticeships. For example, if you're an employer and you want to stand up registered apprenticeship programs in multiple states, you would have to register the same program in multiple states. And so we would love to see some form of state reciprocity. And lastly, any form of the reauthorization of the National Apprenticeship Act, we would like to see intentional support for youth apprenticeships.
Great, thank you. So Miriam, you mentioned that you're doing a lot of technical assistance work at JFF, and we know that you're working closely with a lot of states right now through the Policy Academy, as well as an aligned community of practice that you have around youth apprenticeship at NGA. I'm wondering if the two of you can talk to us a little bit about what kinds of barriers you're seeing at the state level. Jack, can I go to you first this time?
Sure. I think it starts with the conversation that we're just having about there being kind of a lack of a federal standard. And so the good news is, though, that a lot of our states are doing great work in standing up their own systems. And so just to kind of pick up on their point quickly before answering your question, Sarah, I would just say that defining and developing standards at the federal level is certainly key to scale, but because we've been in an environment now for however many years where there hasn't been federal parameters, states have kind of taken that work up on their own. And so I would just say quickly that any kind of federal standard definition has to acknowledge the systems that are being stood up in states already, in localities already, and kind of the great work that everyone in the room here is doing to this point. Sorry, now I forgot your question.
Barriers that you're seeing at the state level.
Well, liability insurance is something that I've learned a lot about in the last 6 months or so. I hope to be an expert soon. I think there's several of you are here, but I think, Miriam, you were going to pick up on that point too.
Liability insurance. I didn't think I'd come to a conference to talk about liability insurance, but that is a key theme that shows up for us, when we do our employer engagement work in communities with employers. The first thing that we hear about is sort of like young people. I think if you attended the Accenture panel earlier this morning, someone on the panel alluded to it. So there's this fear by employers about having young people in the workplace. And one of the things that we try to do at JFF is sort of like walk employers and other apprenticeship stakeholders through what can be perceived fears or real. So around liability insurance, we've put a lot of resources in sort of like understanding the Fair Labor Standards Act, right? Really understanding, there are these 17 hazardous occupations where, individuals under 18 are not permitted to work, but there are 17 of your most hazardous occupations that I don't even know adults should be working in. But outside of that, some of the considerations that we work through with employers and other stakeholders is around understanding, so you're committed to putting in an apprenticeship together. You're committed to the young adult population, but you still have fears. Let's walk through understanding, what your own policies and procedures are. What are some examples of things you might look for? So you might explore ways to get additional insurance for having young people on the job. In Kentucky, we found a really great model where the Kentucky Department of Education partnered with ADECO. ADECO gets the insurance for the young people, they pay the wages, and so they provide that support to the employer. Also, there are intermediary organizations that also provide that insurance, and this is all outside of workers' comp. But there are so many different models around what school systems can do. In Texas, the school district is the one that holds the insurance, so all young people can participate in a work-based learning opportunity. And then school systems oftentimes have insurance that protects young people when they are in a work-based learning opportunity. So it's never a no. It's really about understanding what the barrier is, and then we work by dispelling myths and by providing resources, by sharing examples that are coming from community. And I do have a pitch. We do have a webinar that we're doing, I think, in December at some point with the PIA Network, but really to dispel some of these and to have some conversations and to equip you. Employers have real fears about these, and these are rightly so, but there are ways to make it more accessible, to provide more clarity for all the stakeholders.
And I believe that webinar is January 24th.
Oh,
so
okay.
mark your calendars and please plan to join us for that one. But let me open up to other folks. Other promising innovations that you're seeing at the state level. Anything else you'd lift up?
I think something that's encouraging is the focus that states have on expanding apprenticeships in new and emerging industries. So I know that in fiscal year 2021, 0.2%, so not even 1%, of active apprentices in registered apprenticeship programs were in the finance and insurance industry. So it's encouraging to see states such as Colorado, which has a committee that is specific to supporting new and emerging industries and standing up apprenticeship programs. And so that's work we're excited about.
I'll quickly pick up on that too from the state side. One encouraging practice that we're seeing increasingly is public state agencies developing youth apprenticeships within their own agency. And so your Department of Workforce Development standing up a youth apprenticeship program, your Department of Education. So it's a little bit of like the state acting as a model employer, right? And so when you're having conversations with employers about your programs, you can say, well, we stood up a youth apprenticeship here at the Department of X, and I think that's just good practice.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And we're seeing more and more governors and mayors look at that. We heard from the city yesterday here in New York where a lot of young people are going into public sector apprenticeships. In Colorado, we've been doing that for quite some time, where the Colorado Workforce Development Council's entire Salesforce system was stood up and implemented by a high school apprentice. And that kid is incredible. And they would have never been able to afford him if he was a 30-year-old with a Salesforce administration. So there is something about this opportunity for public sector to leverage youth apprenticeship to get into these tech spaces where they can't compete with private sector salaries, frankly. I think another thing that's really exciting, and a lot of this was spurred by JFF's Big Blur report, is this idea of blending where learning is happening and what institutions work is being credited to and where credit is being attributed to, and particularly getting more credit for work-based learning and that equivalency of that learning, so that we're not just looking at SAT scores, for example, for school performance metrics. That's something that's coming out of some of the recent legislation in Colorado, where we have task forces looking about how we actually measure what's happening in the real world, in working places, on the job, and using credit for prior learning with industry credentials, for example, to award that credit and give that stackability, that permeability. What I'll say is that we've done a good job of piloting a lot of that in this country, institution by institution, a lot of handshakes and relationships and articulation agreements, but we're not doing it as an actual system. We're not doing it K-12 to higher ed. We're doing it this school to this school. And even where we do have systems of community colleges, oftentimes one school will accept something that another school won't, even within that same system. So we've got to break down these institutional barriers and stop jockeying for who gets to be the innovative one and who wants to bring in the money, and actually create system articulations across the board.
Brianna, one of the challenges we hear a lot about from folks in the field is the challenge of employer engagement, bringing employers to the table and getting them to engage around apprenticeship and youth apprenticeship. Is there an opportunity for policy to provide any solutions to that?
Yeah, one of the things we talk about in our recommendations is the importance of intermediaries for the reasons that a lot of people have talked about on this stage. So something that policymakers can do is provide sustained support for intermediaries, because since they play such a key role in allowing businesses, particularly small and mid-sized businesses, to stand up apprenticeship programs.
Anyone else? Any other insights around policy and employer engagement?
I'll certainly plug investing in intermediaries. This requires infrastructure. There's a lot of stakeholders that you're coordinating. There's a lot of people that you're working with, and a lot of barriers that you're up against. And you have to have organizations that are explicitly focused on that and really coming from a neutral perspective. They're not trying to fulfill other requirements for their institution in order to do this. They're really doing this in the best interest of that business and that student. And that neutral advocacy is essential. And I think we need to have more of that infrastructure stood up in this country.
And I think I'll jump in to that. So at JFF, I think in the my opening remarks, I talked about our being a youth apprenticeship intermediary contractor. And I keep referring back to yesterday's panel where the feds did talk about, there are 20 intermediary organizations out there, but they all have a beginning and end date. The tasks are really clearly articulated by the funders. So I would just say there, further calls to action for sustained funding for these intermediaries. Apprenticeship has a really long lead time. So I've been in this space for a while now, and when we were first an intermediary in our first year, we learned so much, right? So, and we're building on that knowledge. So having a sustained funding for intermediary organizations to continue to do the work, I would call for that. And, bringing new organizations in is great, but keeping that sustained group of intermediary organizations that have the experience that they could build on is a call that I would continue to make.
Great. And Dr. Reynolds' keynote earlier, she mentioned the importance of being equitable and how we approach this work and really making sure that we're inclusive and making sure that all young people have access to these types of high-quality youth apprenticeship opportunities. What role can policy and investment play in helping to promote equity and ensure equity on on-the-ground programs?
I think that comes back to the comment that I made earlier around having system-wide articulations. When only one school gets the benefit of a pathway that they've been able to invest in and build themselves, it doesn't give that same access to other students who might be coming from a district or a school that might not have the same programs, that might not have those same relationships, that might not have the same employer partnerships. And so creating system-wide articulations, creating these regional intermediaries and regional support networks that can bring together employers for the entire economy in that region, not just that fortunate school district that has those personal relationships. That's a huge access point that we need to create.
Anyone else? All right. Any other promising innovations in policy and system change you want to lift up before we transition to a call to action for our audience?
I would just, kind of put a fine point on what Ryan was mentioning. It's just, if you, because you have successful programs, I would encourage, maybe not to step on the call to action, but think about what it would look like to codify what you're doing, of what relationships you've built and what kind of norms exist within your programs and what it might look like to put that practice into policy, so that when there's an administration change, when there's turnover, things can continue to serve students. And so I think that, kind of being an advocate for your programs in that way and plugging into the policy-making process is huge, especially for a relatively undefined policy space like youth apprenticeship.
I would also, we're talking a lot about policy, but policy isn't necessarily just legislation.
Yeah.
It's also the influencers of policy and the stakeholders that you're bringing together in this space. So leveraging your mayors, leveraging your governors, leveraging stakeholders who can be advocates for this, employers who often have lobbyists. I think bringing together that coalition at a high level to change the culture around this is actually a part of that policy shift, a part of that systemic shift. To go to something much more specific to policy, I think in Colorado we've seen a lot of success in increasing the resources that we're providing to high schools for industry-recognized credentials. We have often left that as a side metric of how many industry-related credentials a student might get or a school might award, but actually paying them and incentivizing them for that on top of what they're using Perkins funds for is something that we've seen a lot of success in, and have expanded the bucket of general funds that we're using for that in Colorado, and it's increasing the amount of industry-recognized credentials that schools are offering, and that's becoming a core part of their course load that they're offering.
Well, and you mentioned, I think you're bringing up something important, which is that there's both policies that are specific to youth apprenticeship that we want to lift up, but then there's also a whole range of adjacent policies around credit for prior learning, dual enrollment funding, funding for credentials, and those things are equally important and relevant for folks to be weighing in on and watching as we work to advance this work.
Absolutely, and to that point, one of the things that we have to change is how school performance is measured. And I mentioned this earlier, but if school performance is always measured to either matriculation in college or other criteria that helps their students get into college, like our SAT scores, that doesn't actually change any of the systems. We still have the wrong incentives. So no matter how well-intentioned a school is, a CTE teacher is, how open a schedule might be for a young person, it's still not going to be a priority to get them into these types of career opportunities that they could be pursuing. So changing those metrics for how schools are actually measured is a critical thing.
So I think we've already moved into our call to action section, but anything else that we're almost at time here. So anything else that you want to lift up, particularly are there messages that policymakers need to hear from folks in this room that you would call out?
For me, the call to action that I always make is really around centering young people in this apprenticeship work. And I think we'll have panels later that include apprenticeship, but really centering as you're building out your programs, developing your programs, really having time and space to include young people and their caretakers in the design phase, making sure that their voices and perspectives are considered in the programs that you're developing for them. So nothing by us without us is just the call to action that I always make.
Yeah, I guess my call to action is really towards employers and encouraging them to uplift successful stories. I had the pleasure actually of interviewing one of our CareerWise New York former youth apprentices who currently has a full-time job at JP Chase, and her story was just incredible. So I would just ask my fellow employers to uplift stories and really lend the business voice to this conversation.
Sure. Yeah, as a former advocate, totally, understand the value of stories and kind of advocating for your programs, but I would just say bring the data, right? If you're advocating for funding, for codifying existing norms and what you're carrying out with your programs, data is huge. I'd leave it there, I guess.
Yeah, that intersection of qualitative and quantitative is so critical, right? So when we have the story of a young person whose parents lost their jobs in the pandemic, but they were a 16-year-old tech apprentice that got to bring their computer home, and they became the breadwinner for their family. That is a real story of a young apprentice who is learning and earning and keeping their family housed. And then when we look at the data across the board, when graduating cohorts are average earnings are $6 an hour more than their counterparts that didn't go through an apprenticeship, that's huge. As the cost of living continues to increase, we have to find ways to bring that earning in earlier. And that's the kind of data and story combination that really matters and really pushes your legislature.
So the head and the heart. All right, well, please join me in giving a big round of applause for our panelists.